Let's go over now to chapter 8. So now we're 14 months in the future from that time in chapter 3. And it says, and it came to pass, verse 1, in the 6th year, in the 6th month, in the 5th day, so exactly 14 months later, as I sat in mine house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of God fell there upon me.
Holy Spirit.
Yes. And he sees none other than the Lord, I believe is who he sees here. The likeness as of the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his loins downward, fire, from his loins even upward, as the appearance of brightness, as the color of amber. And this glorious being puts his hand forward and takes Ezekiel by a lock of his head, a lock of his hair. And that's a curious way of being transported, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it doesn't hurt him, apparently. So the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. So what happens now is God has brought him in the Spirit to see the sins that are bringing the judgments of God on Israel. So he's being shown the cause of the judgments that God has brought. You see, at this point, there are already a large number of captives that have been taken away by Nebuchadnezzar, but Jerusalem was left more or less intact when Nebuchadnezzar first brought them into subjection. But now Ezekiel's being shown the sins that are continuing, even during the captivity, that are going to bring Nebuchadnezzar back to destroy Jerusalem and this beautiful temple of Solomon's, the first temple. So this is what he's seeing. He's seeing the sins that are going to bring destruction. And the first thing he sees, God brings him to the inner gate of the outer court. Apparently the outer court had an outer gate and an inner gate. And in the inner gate of the outer court was an image of jealousy. That's in verse 3. So idolatry was contaminating the holy places of the most holy section of the center of true worship. And so what you see then is he goes from the inner gate on the north side to the closer gate on the inner court. So he's going from the north through the northern gates, approaching the temple, and he's seeing as he goes these crimes of religious infidelity. So, and behold, the glory of God, verse 4, of Israel was there, according to the vision I saw in the plain. That's in chapters 1 to 3. Then he said unto me, Son of man, lift up thine eyes now the way toward the north. So I lifted up mine eyes the way toward the north, and behold, northward at the gate of the altar. So this is the inner gate of the inner court. So he's gone from the outer court into the inner gate, and he's looking from the porch, apparently, to the north gate of the inner court. And there's an image of jealousy there. And then God instructs him, furthermore unto me, Son of man, seest thou what they do, even the great abomination that the house of Israel committeth here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary? But turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations. And he brought me to the door of the court. And when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. And he said unto me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I digged in the wall, behold, a door. And he said unto me, Go in and behold the wicked abominations that they do there. Now, one of the things I think the Lord is trying to teach us today is that there are different levels of spiritual infidelity. And as you get closer and closer to the sanctuary, the crimes, the transgression gets progressively more serious and grave. So now when he's here, right in the very courts, the holy courts of the temple where the altar is, he's being shown men who have secret chambers in this area of the temple, and that, in modern terms, this is like the sacred inner recesses of our hearts, where we're unfaithful to God, and our minds are corrupt. And this is demonstrated in these people by he sees every form of creeping things and beasts that are painted in these chambers of their imagery, where they outwardly manifest what's already in their hearts. Verse 11 says, and there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. These are leaders, corrupt leaders. These are real men that were doing this. And Ezekiel's taken by his hair all the way from Babylon, where he's sitting in front of the elders of Judah, who are in captivity, and he's transplanted right into the heart of the sanctuary, where he sees other leaders who have been left behind to be managers, during the captivity that Nebuchadnezzar allowed to continue graciously. And here's what they're doing. Verse 11, and there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. In the midst of them stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, and every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. So they're worshiping. And they're offering incense to these grotesque images and their idols. So their mind is perverse. And this is what's bringing the judgment of God on them. They're steeped. Their minds are saturated with evil.
And this perversity is reflected in the very house of God.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And then I can't help but think of what's going on now.
Right. Now these could be priests. There are probably some priests, but they could also be princes that are, not of the tribe of Levi or the tribe or of the family of Aaron, because they're in an area of the temple where they're allowed to be. So, but these are leading men. It says ancients of the house of Israel, leaders. And they're saying, as they do this, in verse 12, the last part, they say, the Lord seeth us not. Isn't that interesting? The Lord hath forsaken the earth. We're not going to be called to account, is what they're saying. Their blasphemy is directly denying that God is going to hold them accountable, which is what is going on today in modern society. It's the same thing. The Lord has forsaken the earth. We can do our lusts. We can do our perversities. We can do our crimes. We can riot. We can burn property and steal and loot, and we're okay. And the man says to him, turn again, but there is even more. There's more still. Turn thee yet again, verse 13. And thou shalt see greater abominations that they do. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women, weeping for Tammuz. So it seems as though the Lord ranks this even as more egregious, because we're getting closer and closer to the sanctuary. We'll see what the worst sin is that brings on his cult for the destroyers of the city to come forward. But here women are weeping for Tammuz, which of course is a heathen deity of fertility. And they're praying that God will bless. They do this in the spring, apparently. In the east, the heathen nations would supplicate Tammuz to give fertility to their plantings and to their livestock, to have an abundant harvest. Okay, verse 15. Then he said unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these. See, notice he keeps saying that. Greater, greater, greater. So this is what we're seeing. And this one that we're about to see here is the greatest of them all. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord's house, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east. And they worshiped the sun toward the east. And that's where God drew the line. That was the greatest of them all. And then you'll see here shortly, right after this, he says he cried, verse 1 of chapter 9, he cried in mine ear with a loud voice, saying, Cause them that have charge over the city to draw near, even every man with his destroying weapon in his hand. So they had crossed the line when they did that. These men, these 25, if heathenism hadn't taken hold on the men of Judah, these 25 men would all have to have been priests, because only the priests were allowed in that vicinity between the porch and the altar. The common people could come up to the altar of burnt offering, and were required, actually, the men were required to bring their sacrifice to the altar, and the men, the lay people and the priests were required to slay their sacrifice beside the altar. But the priests were to apply the blood, and in cases where the blood was to be brought in the sanctuary, they were to go with the blood into the sanctuary, but the men were not to do that. So these 25 men, if they were still observing any part of the law, they would have been priests. And if they were priests, they were directly responsible for heathen worship of the sun. And that is where the Lord drew the line. And that's where he's going to draw it today.
Yeah, and then I'm wondering, that they made the golden calf.
Yeah.
But they were making it, saying they're worshiping God, have a feast unto the Lord.
Right.
And I'm wondering if these people who meet even on Easter morning, Sunday morning, that they're just doing it to the Lord, while they're celebrating the resurrection.
I think the majority are.
Yeah, some are ignorant, but I wonder how ignorant all of them are.
Yeah.
And
I would say the Jesuits generally have a pretty accurate knowledge. They know that that this is, that they're doing what these men are doing. There's an obelisk outside the Lateran Mother Church, and that's what that obelisk is. It's worshiping the sun. You know, I think we went over some of this last week. So he cries for these people to come forward, and behold, verse 2, 6 men come from the way of the higher gate, which lieth toward the north. So notice that's where they come from. They take the same route where all of these idolatrous worships were taking place. They come through the same gates of the temple. And they also come from the north, which is the direction that Babylon comes to destroy Jerusalem from the north. And then there's a seventh man who comes with them, and he's the one that, rather than slaughtering weapons, this man has the writer's inkhorn. And you know the story here, how the man with inkhorn is told to put the mark on the faithful, and the others are told to destroy those who don't have the mark. Ellen White says that this chapter is going to be literally fulfilled. Are you aware of that?
Yeah.
That should make us.
I don't know if I have that written here or not.
If you do, that would be good to read.
What chapter?
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. Yeah. Yeah, there's another statement in Isaiah 3 that she says in the end time will be literally fulfilled. And why that's interesting, because you sometimes wonder how this, and I can understand how this will be fulfilled literally. But the Isaiah one, why that's interesting.
We should have a look at that on another day. So, you know, just keeping that in the back of our minds that this is literally going to be fulfilled. I'll read a little bit of it. To the others, God said, go after him. Go after the man clothed in linen with the writer's inkhorn, through the city and smite. Let not your eye spare, neither have pity. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women. Imagine that. So, in terms of literally fulfilled, there's no, the temple has been destroyed years ago. So this would be what she is implying, if she didn't say it directly, is that this is talking about God's church.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was the very center of God's church at that time. And this is the great cleansing. You know, when Christ cleansed the temple, that was a symbol of this, I believe. And most of the people fled, right? But the children didn't flee, and the pure in heart didn't flee. And once the people who were defiling the house were cleansed, then the glory of God was flooded the temple, and Jesus took the children in his arms. He healed the sick, and it was a strong foretaste of heaven when this occurred. That's, I believe, what is going to happen. It's going to be very ugly for a lot of people, but for a lot of people, when the courts are cleared, it's going to be glorious. But while this clearing goes on, here's what we're supposed to do, like Ezekiel and like Joel. Cry between the porch and the altar as these things are transpiring. It says in verse 8, and it came to pass, while they were slaying him, I was left. And I fell upon my face and cried and said, Ah, Lord God, wilt thou destroy all the residue of Israel in thy outpouring of thy wrath, of thy fury upon Jerusalem. And God is in no mood to relent. Notice what he says. The iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceeding great, and the city is full of blood. The city is full of perverseness. The land is full of blood. For they say, the Lord hath forsaken the earth. The Lord hears what we say. He's repeating the blasphemy, and the Lord seeth not. As for me also, mine eye shall not spare. The Lord, when he makes up his mind, he's not like man. He doesn't relent. The decision's been made, the account has been closed, and you want to be on the right side when the account closes.
That's right.
The Lord is not man. The Lord doesn't make a mistake. So when everything has been possibly done to persuade, to woo, to win by love, and when it's been stubbornly, repeatedly rejected, the Lord will finally accept that decision. And then his decision is final. He's accepted your decision.
Yeah, that last verse there in chapter 8, it says, though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. So
It'll be the cry of a Judas, though, right?
yeah, it'll be
It won't be that they're repentant because they're sorry. It'll be repentance because they don't want the consequence.
yeah, they don't want to pay the bill on their sin.
Yeah. So that kind of a cry, God shuts his ear to. He has accepted, our decisions, and his acceptance is final. Interesting in verse 10, then I looked, and behold, in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubim, there appeared over them, as it were, a sapphire stone, as the appearance of the likeness of the throne. So that's the Lord appears as judge here, right? And as judge, he makes a decision. I think that's what that is about. So the picture here is that the cherubim have let down their wings, and God speaks in judgment, and he says, I accept your decisions. And, the door of mercy for many, many people is shut, forever shut. But then he tells the man who has put the mark, the seal on all these people, he has accepted their decision. They're his. He's accepted the decision of others. They're Satan's. So Satan has his, the Lord has his. But then there's this commission to the man in linen to get the fire between the cherubim and to scatter it over the city. And it's interesting that when they do that, let's just read it here in verse 3. Now the cherubim stood on the right side of the house, which wouldn't it be the north side, the right side as you're looking west into the sanctuary? So what's on the west side? On the west side, you have the table of showbread, right? In the holy place. And the picture you have here is that God is over the table of showbread. And what's on the showbread? 12 loaves, right? There's two piles of 6 loaves each. However they were arranged. I believe that's the way they were arranged. 2 times 6 is 12, of course. And the glory of the Lord appears over them. I believe this is a picture of the 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe. The glory of God appears over them and accepts them as his, and that they are purified. They are clothed in white, and there's no guile found in their mouth. And the judicial decision of heaven is, these are mine. And so that comes from the throne, which is above the mercy seat. But the God of above the mercy seat, the glory goes up and rests above on the right side of the house, on the table of showbread. And then it says in verse 4, then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherubim and stood over the threshold. So it goes from the mercy seat into the holy place, over the showbread, and then to the entry of the holy place. And at this point, the angels have unfolded their wings, because notice what it says. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub and stood over the threshold of the house. And the house was filled with a cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory. And the sound of the cherubim's wings was heard even to the outer court, as the voice of Almighty God when he speaketh. Okay, so are you following that? I'm not saying you have to agree, I'm just asking if you're, following what I'm saying. I mean, we need to study this. So yeah, you're following that? Okay, good. And it came to pass that verse 6, when he had commanded the man clothed with linen, saying, take fire from between the wheels, from between the cherubims, then he went in and stood beside the wheels. So now we're getting a more complete explanation. So you had the overview here in the first 5 verses of chapter 10, and now you're getting more detail. Here's what I believe this is going on. So when he goes in between the wheels, where is the glory of God? Possibly it's still over the cherubim as the throne when he first goes in and gets the holy fire. But I could be wrong on that. That's where I'm thinking it might be at this point, when he's first going in to retrieve the fire, the holy fire. And one cherub stretches forth his hand, verse 7, from between the cherubims unto the fire that was between the cherubims, and took thereof, and put it into the hands of him that was clothed with linen, who took it and went out. And there appeared in the cherubims the form of the man's hand under their wings. And when I looked, behold, the 4 wheels by the cherubims, one wheel by one cherub, and another wheel by another cherub. And the appearance of the wheels was as the color of a beryl stone. And I read in Wikipedia that the most common color of beryl is aquamarine or emerald. So blue, green, or green, if you can picture that. Now beryl, an emerald is actually a beryl. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
And an aquamarine is actually a beryl. It just has it's highly colored. In the case of an emerald, green, and in the case of an aquamarine, blue-green. But beryl can be a much paler tint. And so, but I think we should be thinking, a green or a blue-green here when we're reading this, and maybe a little less intense than an emerald. And as for their appearances, verse 10, they 4 had one likeness, as if a wheel had been in the midst of the wheel. When they went upon their 4 sides, they turned not as they went. Now, it's curious why there is so much detail here of these cherubim right upon the occasion of when the man goes in to get the fire between them. There's a reason. And I believe the reason is that this is this time when the message goes like fire in the stubble. So this is typical of the final outpouring of the latter rain, and heaven and earth come very close. The wheels are on the earth, the spirit of the cherub is in the wheels, and the fire from the very throne of God is animating all of this action. And it's full of action. And it's happening at lightning speed and with the power of lightning. And their whole body, verse 12, and their hands and their eyes and their wheels, their wings or full of eyes. This is a time of great enlightenment. That's the way I interpret it. Verse 13, as for the wheels, it was cried unto them in my hearing, O wheel. Now, a lot of the more modern versions say they were called in my hearing. In other words, Ezekiel is given a deeper insight by the Lord giving him the actual name of the wheels. And in other versions, it says they were called the whirling wheels. Whirling wheels. In other words, they have something of the property of a tornado. Isn't that interesting? And tornadoes are powerful and they're fast. So I think that's a good image. The other name for wheels in the other parts of the chapter are, what we would understand commonly as a wheel on a vehicle, a round object used to transport things, or you get the idea. So, but there's more to it, is what I think inspiration is telling us. And so Ezekiel's given this other name or label for these wheels that helps to explain what it's all about. Verse 14, and everyone had 4 faces. The first was the face of a cherub. So we're going here back to the same imagery that we have in chapters 1 to 3. And the same idea that when the wheels go, these cherubs go. When the cherubs go, the wheels go. That's verse 16 and verse 17. And now notice verse 18. Then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house. Remember, that's where he went. It appears that he went from his location normally, the Lord's location normally in the sanctuary was above the mercy seat. And he had gone from the mercy seat to above the table of showbread to the threshold of the house, and now that's where he is. And it says in verse 18, then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house, which of course is the entrance to the holy place, and stood over the cherubim. Now notice where the Lord goes. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. And what happens when they mount up from the earth? They're moving their wings, right? So there's this great glory and noise and majesty. And when they went out, the wheels all were beside them, and everyone stood at the door. Now this is where they go, to the east gate. So they've gone from the threshold of the house to the door of the east gate. And it doesn't say if it's the east gate of the inner court or the outer court. But in my opinion, it's of the outer court in this case, because notice where they go next, verse 20. This is the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river of Kibar. Chapters 1 to 3 again. And I knew they were the cherubim. Everyone had 4 faces apiece, and the likeness of their faces was the same faces which I saw by the river Kibar, and their appearances in themselves, and they went everyone straight forward. Over and over again, we have the picture that God's purposes move straight forward. There's no turning away the purpose of God. It moves straight forward. Moreover, now we're into chapter 11, verse 1. Moreover, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me unto the east gate of the Lord's house, which looketh eastward. And behold, at the door of the gate, 25 men. So you have the picture now that Ezekiel goes from between the porch and the altar, or thereabouts, which I believe that's where he was. He has seen the glory of God move to over the east gate, and then the glory of God lifts him up and brings him to the same place. So now there are 3 different entities, let's say, at the east gate of the Lord's house. There's Ezekiel, there's the glory of God and the cherubim, and there's these 25 men. And we're out of time, so we'll end it here. But you might want to read and see where the glory of God goes next, for next week.